Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Emit Blackwell and I am here with the winner of the first ever Blackwell Short Story Award, Richard Le Tourneau, for his short story, Lake Sebastian. This chilling story takes us back to the 1880s. Hector Stanton, the protagonist, has a dark past and a complex desire to get away. This will leave the reader feeling compassion and disgust. This is a compressed version of a larger story that Richard started for this contest. If you have a chance, check it out on Amazon.com. Listen as Hector Stanton finally faces the sins of his past life. Lake Sebastian by Richard Le Tourneau. The people of New Burnley were a peculiar sort, having been secluded within acres of remote woodland. Very few knew of its existence, and those who did never attempted to reach it. Lake Sebastian rested beyond dirt paths and narrow cliffs. It was so named due to the unfortunate death of New Burnley's founder, Naval Officer Sebastian Mantle, on August 9, 1759. Now, the tracks lay hidden beneath overgrown grass and weeds. Those who dare tread the old ways are often lost, claimed by the woods or the treacherous lake, their souls trapped forever. Tales told over the years claim the forest had voices which spit vile words to all who became misguided on their journey. Only a few bodies were ever found since the rumors of 1770. Most who live in the land beyond New Burnley believe that a witch or some other powerful entity lives within the depths of its woods. It's the fall of 1880. More tales have been told, tales that kept men, women, and especially children away from the narrow fated path. Hector cared little for these tales and superstitions, and those in particular, which he had been told the people of New Burnley believed in. During that first day, he was shaken. It was during a long hike up the hills, around the crumbling cliffs and past Lake Sebastian when he discovered what happened to a person who committed a crime. At the crest of the final hill that overlooked the wooden pillars hanging the welcome sign to New Burnley, his attention was drawn to a crucified man. Crows adorned his arms and head, their usual innocent claws now sinister as the winged scavengers pecked at the maggots and flies from within. One fluttered on the corpse's face and fed upon a tasty morsel dangling from an empty socket. His mouth was sewn shut. A spike was driven up through the bottom of his chin and buried in his chest to prop his head up. But what made the breakfast stir in Hector's stomach was the man's penis and testicles nailed under the body, two crows fighting over it. The memories surfaced like electric shocks running through his body. Murder, rape, horror. The hairs on his back stood up as he remembered the deafening howl of the innocent creature and the pleading look in the victim's eyes. A memory of a lifetime ago, of a man he used to be. He knew he should have turned and ran rather than continue along that path. An orange hue spread across the once pale clouds, turning them bloody. A gray wolf emerged from a bush, teeth white, itching to be stained with blood, its black pit staring back into Hector's hazel eyes. Its back arched, hairs stood on end. Another crept from the tree line, and then another three from the right. Hector stepped back, following the widened path even closer toward the sign. His grip tightened on his small leather bag, which contained all of his worldly possessions. The wolves flashed their teeth as their large paws gated closer and exceeded every pace Hector dared to take. His pulse raced. He peeked over his shoulder toward the looming buildings, and then back to his pursuers, who made his fate appear even more ominous with the red and orange glow in the sky behind them. He ran. The wolves gave chase. Their snarls and thick breathing, although several meters behind, felt as if it was inches behind. As he passed the sign, the pursuit ceased, as if some barrier had appeared, halting their hunt. They howled and clawed the ground, but didn't approach. Hector ran into the village, his heavy bag slapping against his leg. A group of men approached, armed with muskets, bows, and furrowed brows. They surrounded him. Their attire was modern, despite the overwhelming fact that they were so cut off from society. Yet all about town, everything appeared modern, apart from the path into the village. Hector cleared his throat and explained his predicament. The villagers shook his hand and told him they were naturally cautious due to the lack of visitors. A downpour ensued without warning. despite a previously bright sky. Now, it was gray and black with flashes of sharp light and booms that shook the ground. They escorted him up a hill shielded by a thick canopy and weary dangling branches to the village center. A church came into view. Just past the church lay the headstones of the cemetery. The largest of them belonged to Sebastian. The last name was hardly legible. May 2nd, 1700 to August 9th, 1759. A priest slowly raised and turned toward them. He had peppered hair and a wrinkled face spattered with dirt. He narrowed his eyes and approached as they passed, only stopping at the stone wall, glaring. Hector turned back. Still, the priest stared. The path continued down the hill and between some houses to the office of Horatio Bannington, the mayor. The stout, balding Horatio invited them in. The two men followed close behind. Horatio gestured to the vacant burgundy leather seat in the front of his desk. He then opened a decanter in the shape of a castle and poured them both a drink. "Welcome to New Burnley," he said, handing over the glass of whiskey before sitting down in his high-backed leather chair. "Thank you, but..." Hector cradled his glass with both hands. "I don't drink, not anymore." Horatio stared at him, puzzled. Okay. Thank you for your honesty." Droplets of rain dripped from Hector's hair. He set the glass on the desk and bounced his leg nervously. "Tell me about yourself. What's your name, stranger?" "I'm Hector Santon," he replied. "What brings you here? Not many know of our home, and even fewer know how to get here." Horatio drew the glass under his nose and closed his eyes as he savored the sweet scent before taking a sip. "As strange as it sounds, I went for a walk. I've heard about this place and decided to see if the rumors were true." "Rumors?" the mayor grunted. His eyes widened. "What rumors?" He scrunched his face. Hector stared at the mayor, then the drink. He considered taking it down in one swift swig. "Just that it's a hard place to reach, and you're just also cut off from everyone here. That you live in the past. The other rumor was that there are ghosts in the forest." "Do you believe the rumors?" "Everything but the part about the ghosts," he said, jittering his leg again. He eyed the drink. "That's preposterous." "Indeed. Tell me, Mr. Stanton, do you believe in God?" Yes. There was no hesitation in his voice. If that man who was strung up had been there because he no longer believed, Hector knew he would need to play along. He could do it. He'd done it before. He was a liar. A good one at that. "Excellent. I'm glad to hear that," Horatio smiled. "Let me apologize for the sight outside. The man, Vincent Watts, he didn't. He raped a girl, and here, in this peaceful community, we enforce strict laws." Hector's hands trembled. He reached for the glass. His fingertips knocked it forward, spilling its contents over the side of the desk. He snatched the now empty glass before it could roll off. "I'm so sorry." Hector retreated back into the seat, wide-eyed. "Don't worry about it. Why did you try to find New Burnley? You said that you heard about it, and you were out for a walk. To me," the mayor tapped his finger against his chin and furrowed his brow, "to me it's odd that someone would make an attempt to find this place based on rumors and curiosities. And I'm assuming belongings are in that bag, so you planned on finding this place? Do you consider yourself an explorer?" No, I don't." "You still haven't answered my first question." I've changed my mind. I think I'll have that drink." Hector stirred. Horatio glanced at the guard beside the door. "Will you answer my question?" "Yes." "Well, then talk. You can have the bottle if you're honest." "My wife. She died 11 months ago. And I didn't want to be at my job any longer. I didn't want to clean myself, and the people who I considered my friends didn't want to know me. There was a sickness in my mind which took me to some dark places. But now it's gone. Our eldest, Lucas, was kidnapped the following month. I had nothing to live for. I was out walking and possibly looking for a change. Belonging somewhere drew me here." "I'm sorry for the loss of your wife. Mind if I ask how she died?" Childbirth." "That is God's choice. He makes some choices we agree with and others we question, though it doesn't do well to dwell on those things. The questions, his reasons. If it is meant to be, then it shall be. That was my wife and son. They're with God now. Hector lowered his head into his hands. Tears filled his eyes. He fought them back. Here, you've earned it. Horatio nodded and passed the bottle of whiskey to Hector. Thank you. Hector poured a little into the glass. He smelled it. Like a pair of old friends meeting again for the first time in years, he drew it to his lips, allowing it to splash them. His lips parted. The deep, crisp copper liquid tingled his cheek. Its seamless blend of flavors was sweet and familiar, with a punch that burned its way down his throat. Number 5 is vacant, Hector said with a snuffle. If you still wish to stay, we can go over the rules tomorrow. How does that sound? My own place? Yes, Horatio grinned. Thank you, Hector replied, shaking his hand. Thank you so much. Horatio gave him the key, and the guards took him to his new home. It was in pristine condition from the look of the exterior. It was a single-story home, with 3 steps leading to a porch and 2 flower pots on either side of the door. As he stepped in, he drew the first breath in his new home. The odors of the previous inhabitant attacked his senses. He cringed. It was the smell of death. He'd smelled it before. He dropped his bag on the floor. He blinked and rubbed his eyes furiously as the flies buzzed around the room. He swatted a dozen in one swipe, only to have another dozen, maybe more, come for him. They landed on his head and arms, crawled up his sleeves and down the back of his shirt. He patted himself all over, slapping his own face to rid them. He considered confronting the mayor and then thought about leaving the village and returning home. But that wasn't an option. He pressed on, swatting the air. An atrocious stench cloud of filth and decay-ridden flies met him through the arch to the kitchen. Their crap and pus-covered legs patted his face. Lying at the foot of the sink was a dead dog, its guts on display like a butcher's window. Maggots wiggled over the meat and gray fur of what was once an Irish wolfhound. Feces scattered the ground, creating a minefield. Hector covered his mouth, drew in a deep breath, and held it. He leaned over the dog and reached for the window. He pushed. It was stuck. He tried once more. It nudged away with a crack and flew open. He slipped forward, squelch, crunch. Flies swarmed up. Through their buzzing, he glanced down. His foot was lodged inside the open cavity. Pale maggots squirmed over his shoe. He lifted his foot free from the mess and kicked the cupboard, sending the larvae into the air and onto the floor. The room was black with winged pests. He covered his mouth and looked around the room. 3 cupboards hung on the wall to the right, with another 3 behind him. Some of the cupboards contained plates, cups, and a sporadic bounty of mismatched tins and faded labels. In one of the others, glasses, a bottle of wine, and 2 bottles of rum. Another contained some potatoes, a wrinkled apple, pots, and a cup filled with mold. Hector left the room and headed down the hall. There was a door on both sides and one ahead. He opened the door to the right. It was a dining room and a study. It contained a table and chairs adorned with embroidered tablecloth and a scratched, hair-covered leather chair, desk, and bookcase. The room to the right was a bathroom, and in everything he had seen so far, it was clean. The toilet bowl, although browning, was clean, and compared to the plates, it was clean enough to eat off of. Before he opened the last door, he could hear the buzzing inside as if the door was made of paper. He pushed forward. Another corpse was riddled with maggots and flies. It was a young woman barely out of her teen years. Her throat had been slit. The last moment of her life had been sputtered over the wall beside the bed. Her long blonde hair stained red and covered her face. He ran out of the house and set off back to the mayor's office. A dozen or so villagers emerged like hungry birds on a garden full of worms. They stared as Hector pounded the door. "Hello, Hector. How may I help you?" asked the mayor. "You can start by getting that dead dog and the teenage girl out of my new house." "Please," Horatio gestured him inside. "Sit, my friend." "No, I'd rather stand. What's going on here? How can my house be filled with flies and dead bodies?" "Flies?" "Yes, flies, millions of them. As soon as I walked through the door, they were on me. There's a dead dog with its innards on the kitchen floor, but what sickens me the most is the murdered girl on my bed." "Sit, please," the mayor urged and gestured to the vacant seat. "There's no dog, or girl, or plague of flies in your home. Of that I'm certain. You've had a long journey to get here, and I was told you met with some of the wildlife. It's natural to hallucinate when you're stressed or tired." "I know it's real, and I know it's not. This was real. Go see for yourself." "Okay," the mayor started. "William, Malcolm, Oliver, can you come in here, please?" he hollered. Seconds later, 3 men stepped in through the door. Is there a problem, sir?" one asked. "No, not here. Number 5 appears to be, according to our new resident, a scene of abject horror. I need you to go there, make sure it's safe for him to return home, and remove the bodies he says that are there." "Bodies?" he asked with a slight grin. "Yes, you heard me correctly," the mayor asserted. "Consider it done," the man replied. "Let's go, Hector." "What, me?" Hector pointed to himself. The man nodded. "You got to show us where the bodies are." "I will. I bloody well will. You'll see." They walked through the village and entered the house. Nothing. No flies, no dog, and no dead girl. The blood that had stained the wall and sheets were gone. "Oi, where are the bodies?" the man asked.
"Oh, I don't see any bodies,"
the second man echoed.
No bodies, nothing,"
the third man mumbled. "But they were here. I'm not making this up," he bellowed and thumped the wall. "I saw them. It was horrible."
"They're not here. There's nothing," the man said.
"I guess it was all in my head," Hector whispered.
"That's what the mayor told you," the second man chortled. "Come on, let's go," he said, leading the way out of the house.
Hector slammed the door behind them. "What the hell is going on here?" he said aloud. He stared into the kitchen. The window was still open. Inside, the cupboards, tins, wrapped food, plates, and everything else was in order. The flies were gone, and the stench that lingered like a fog was also absent. "How?" he mumbled, and slumped into a tatty fabric chair. He gripped the ends of the frayed arms and scratched it. A gentle rapping came from the door. Hector went back to the kitchen to ignore the noise. Another knock came, then another, each growing louder.
"Hello? I heard you just arrived,"
a woman's voice began.
And I wanted to say hello.
Hector crept toward the door.
I brought you a welcome to New Burnley gift, I guess. I guess. I'll leave it by the door. Bye."
Footfalls tapped along the porch. Hector waited a few seconds before cracking open the door. The villagers were going about their business. At the foot of the door, resting on a plate, were 3 hot cross buns and a wedge of apple fruit cake. He glanced around. No one was watching as he picked it up and retreated back inside. Immediately he plated the bun and tucked in. It was still warm, welcoming, and filled his nostrils and mind with the nostalgia of his mother's baking. He took another bun. The white plate was hand-painted with a scenic image of New Burnley. The picturesque view of the church and trees taken from the edge of the path where the church came into view. The painting was as clear as day, and as perfect as if a true master had lent his hand to the craft. Another knock came again. He opened the door. "Hello," he said. Standing before him was a young woman with wavy blonde hair that stretched down to her elbows. She wore a cream dress with blue trim. "I'm going to guess it was you who left the tasty treats." She blushed and lowered her head. "The buns were delicious. I have one left. You're more than welcome to join me. It would be nice to know more about where I'm living, and the people, too." She lifted her gaze back to his. Hector stared into her pale blue eyes. I don't know if I should." "That's okay." "It's not you. It's my family, and it doesn't matter." She let out a deep sigh and shook her head. "Never mind. I can deal with them." Hector stepped inside. "Please come in." Before the words had time to pass through the air, she was inside. She looked around the room and ran her fingers across the crucifixes opposite the kitchen. Hector grabbed another bun and passed one to her. "I'm Hector." "I know," she said, taking the bun. He stared at her, waiting for a name. She took a bite, then a second. I like it here. Who lived here before me?
Just some guy.
What was he like?
He was kind of strange.
Strange? Hector sniggered. In what way?
He was a liar and a sinner.
Oh, I see. Hector took the first bite of his bun, whereas she was finishing hers. What happened to him?
I'm Fiona, by the way,
she blurted out, extending her hand.
Can't believe I forgot to introduce myself,
she said with a giggle. Hector shook her hand. It was dainty, to his, and smooth, unlike his, chapped and calloused. Nice to meet you, Fiona, he grinned.
Would you like a tour?
She pointed over her shoulder towards the door. Sure, I'd love one. Fiona showed him around the village, introduced him to everyone. He knew he wouldn't remember every name and face. Norman Crump, the butcher, chopped a chicken's head off with his cleaver as they approached. He smiled at Fiona, then winked.
This is Hector. He just moved in.
That's great news. We could do with some new faces around here. Take this, he said, reaching for a freshly plucked and cleaned chicken. Welcome to New Burnley, Hector.
A month soon passed, and Hector had become a beloved member of the community. Not only because of his strange tales of the world beyond their borders, which the villagers enjoyed hearing, but also because there was something unusual about him. He had secrets, and in New Burnley, no one had secrets. Everything was known. Nothing was secret. Not sexual habits, toilet habits, or ailments. It soon became apparent that even the bedroom doors were open. Free love. Everyone was with anyone they chose. Mr. Oliver Wallace would be with his wife Helga Monday, and then Miss Julia Blunt Tuesday, even though she was 20 years younger, considerably slimmer, and had several more teeth in her head than him. If you wanted something or someone, it was available. Hector didn't agree with the free love. He had grown fond of Fiona. She was 19, and was well known around the village by both men and women. He snatched every opportunity to be with her. Their friendship blossomed like the first flowers of spring. Love followed. Smitten, bewitched by her charm and beauty, he sought her company to lay beside. He told her about his hometown and the life he had once had. He kissed her tender lips, tasting the residual flavor of a bun or apple pie. He'd count the days until they would meet again. It may be 1 day, 2, or even 3. When he was beside Fiona, the nightmares were gone, as were the visions of his past. But the sins wouldn't remain hidden in his memories. The nightmares had plagued his mind since the end of the first week. The screams, so many cries, howls of agony, betrayal, love, poured out in the final moments of life, with the only question in their eyes, why? The nightmares became a reality, or at least felt real enough. The bodies were warm, then cold. Icy blood flowed over the sheets and floor. The screams that were in his head were now in his ears. Silver and gold ornaments lay scattered like rubbish, but once touched, turned to dust. Constant reminders of his crimes. Hector took the path up the hill to the church. He sat on a bench in the back. 3 other villagers were praying. One kneeled at the altar, staring up at Christ, muttering. The other 2 had their heads bowed on the front benches. The priest entered through the door to the left. He approached Hector.
Hector, what brings you here?
Father Matthew Dawn asked. He reeked of incense. I come to confess. Father Dawn frowned.
Really?
Hector nodded. Come with me, Father Dawn said, and led Hector down the aisle toward the confession booth at the front of the room. The odor of oak varnish and sweat overpowered him. He brought his hand to his mouth and coughed, then stepped inside and closed the door. A small window opened. I've never done this before. I'm sorry, Father.
You've never confessed before. In all your years you frequented the church in your previous parish, and you never confessed.
Hector thought fast. He recalled the tug of his mother and father taking him to church. He caught the words of his father in confessional. The words flowed like a faucet from Hector's mouth. I have in the past, that's my first time here, confessing. He lowered his head and crossed himself. Oh, I see. How may I help you? Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. What do you need forgiveness for, my son? I'm not the man everyone thinks I am. I've lied. He stopped himself from confessing further.
You're a liar? The priest's voice raised. A liar?
Hector didn't dare continue, but then he thought about it while Father Dawn muttered something. He couldn't hear it. The past crept back into his mind, a flash of blood, a knife, the screams, innards on the outside now. A young woman naked, exposed, bloodied, beaten and stabbed.
Sorry, you took me by surprise. Father Dawn cleared his throat. Do you have any further sins you wish to confess?
No, none. Not that I can think of. Another lie.
Are you sure? You are in the house of God. Here you can say anything, everything, and all will be forgiven.
Everything?
Yes.
God won't judge me?
No, I've heard many things over the years. These ears don't shock easily.
I've been seeing things.
Like what?
Father Dawn's voice softened. Bad things.
Hector, take your time. You'll feel better once this is all off your chest. All secrets are between me and God.
Whatever happened to there are no secrets in New Burnley?
Some secrets can remain secret to me and the Lord.
That's all I have to say, Father.
That's a lie,
he growled. I can't confess everything today. Hector opened the door.
Hector,
Father Dawn bellowed.
Sit!
I don't feel comfortable. I'm leaving.
You shall face your sins. Your despicable crimes have not been forgiven.
Father Dawn's soft voice turned deep and raspy.
Your end is coming.
I beg your pardon? Whatever happened to not being judged?
I've seen your wrongs you've done, heard the cries. I saw them when your feet took the first steps on this land.
I'm not listening to this shit. Hector snapped and left the room, slamming the door shut behind him. All eyes fell on him. Father Dawn stepped out of the confessional and folded his arms. The parishioners turned like drones, watching as Hector left the church. He headed for home. All eyes seemed to be drawn to him. Wheelbarrows carrying full loads lowered. Gardening stopped. Shopkeepers left their establishments. Conversations ceased. Everyone was watching him, their cold glares staring with lifeless eyes and mindless intent. He reached home and slammed the door shut.
What the hell is going on?
He breathed, staring at the door. He stepped back. A fly swept past his gaze and circled around his head as if taunting him. The rancid odor of rotting flesh and crap flooded his nostrils. He shook his head and rubbed his nose in disbelief of the powerful memory he was conjuring. More flies came into his peripheral vision. He looked toward the kitchen. The carcass of the dog was back, as were the flies and the feces. The combined putrid stench drew his food out of his stomach. He vomited onto his shoe. Drawing in a breath, a number of flies flew in, as others went for fresh sustenance. Hector coughed, retched. Tickles filled his throat. He coughed again, then placed 2 fingers in his mouth. Another clump splattered over the floor. He wiped his mouth and stared at the dog. It was Bruce, the family dog, the dog he had killed one day during one of his blackouts. He stepped away from the kitchen. Hector gated toward the bedroom. Clinks, chimes, and dings came from within. He opened the door. In the corner of the room, piled a foot high, were ornaments, jewelry, and all sorts of trinkets. The door slammed shut. The unsteady pile toppled over, leaving his ears ringing as the high-pitched noise echoed around the room. A body, a woman barely at the end of her teen years, laying naked on the bed, her clothes torn and thrown around the room. Blood ran from her neck, a deep cut. Her life force ran down the wall. Her hand twitched, fingers curled. She sat up. Her front was bruised and cut apart, leaving ribbons of meat dangling, exposing her muscles and bones. Her eyes were swollen. She opened one eye and stared at him, then reached out, her blood dripping from her fingertips, her mouth agape as it gasped for air, or maybe desperation to find some words to convey her shock and horror. "Leave me alone," he shouted. She crawled closer. "Go away," Hector shouted. "You're not real." He closed his eyes and covered his ears. Her raspy breathing pierced his defenses. He opened his eyes. Still she came, hands pressed against the floor, head low as her long pale legs dragged behind. He felt for the door handle. Blood covered his hands. His, hers, he wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't. Her head wobbled as it lifted. Her stone-cold, dead green eyes ripped through his resolve. His trembled heart pounded in his chest. Her fingertips brushed the tip of his shoes. Her touch was real, and so was the blood. He reached for the handle and turned it. It didn't move. She grabbed one leg, and then the other. He let out a yell. His eyes widened. Blood dribbled from her mouth onto his trousers. He tried the handle again, but the blood only served to further hinder his escape. The only other option was the window opposite the bed. He threw his hands away from her legs and ran to the window. He lifted the handle and threw it wide, climbing out and landing on the bushes beneath. Thorns tore through his skin and pricked his clothes. He pulled his arm free. Spines were embedded in both arms, legs, and his cheek. As he picked himself up, more curved blades pierced his hands and knees. He pulled the thorns out and started off into the forest. Shouts came from behind. There was no doubt in his mind that they were after him. He ran deeper into the lush woods. The thought of the wolves hunting him and the villagers chasing him made his pulse race faster. Beads of sweat ran down from his brow into his sight, clouding it. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig, and cumbersome thud had Hector on edge with darting eyes. He journeyed further, unknowing if he was going in circles or heading back toward the village, or the snarling, drooling jaws of death. He slowed to a jog, then a walk, and wondered why the villagers would be chasing him. He hadn't done anything wrong. Well, nothing they knew about. His crimes were all secret to the villagers. Only those from the old town knew of his crimes. Why would they be chasing him from New Burnley? Merely because he was a liar? It didn't make any sense. They were chasing him, weren't they? It was the mad priest who spooked him. Maybe the villagers weren't looking for him at all. A figure moved from behind a tree ahead and stopped behind another. Hector froze. Another figure darted past. A gentle breeze played with the leaves and carried with it a scent of algae and mud. He turned away and headed back. More figures crept around the trees. A hand hugged one of the trunks as a face clouded by a hood sneered at him, then vanished. Further hands and hooded figures came into view, moving through the woods. He glanced back. Those from behind were moving closer. Toward his left, there appeared to be less. No one in sight. He dashed through the vegetation. The figures gave chase. Twigs snapped behind. Feet clomped in pursuit. He didn't fancy finding out if these were the villagers or the spirits of the woods he had heard rumors of in the past. A foul odor assaulted his nostrils the further he ran. His shoes met with soft ground, softer still, until it had become wet and sloppy mud. His boots bogged down and squelched free with every tug. Every step a struggle. Hector looked back. He couldn't see the figures. He continued trudging through the mud. The ground released its burden from him several meters later. Mud became firm footing, and despite the added weight of his socks and shoes, he gained pace and broke free of the dense forest. Thick woodlands soon became scarce of trees and bushes and had become lush with long grass and flowers. Light danced upon a mirror in the distance. His chest tightened. He walked to the trees and clung to one. He grasped for air and pressed his hand to his chest. After a minute, the weight ceased. He stared ahead. He was at Lake Sebastian. Algae covered what was possibly once a beautiful lake. The foul odor struck his nostrils again. He'd smelled it before. It was that smell of death. Decay. He released the tree and stepped forward. He stumbled forward, dazed. Another blow struck the back of his head. A dozen or more figures came into view. His head slumped. Arms reached out and grasped for trees. No, not a tree. A person. Another hit connected, knocking him off balance. He fell to his knees. The world was spinning like the worst hangover he'd ever had. Figures surrounded him, staring down. His blurred vision faded into darkness. Warmth, light, and heat intensified. His legs were numbing. He realized he was on his knees, and his hands were tied behind his back. They brushed against the object restricting him. It was a wooden stake. A pounding headache ensued, pulling everything out of focus before easing, for a moment, allowing him to see once more. It was night, and the villagers were surrounding him. They were all dressed in hooded robes and carrying flaming torches. The crowd parted. A pair walked toward him. They pulled their hoods back. It was Horatio and Father Don. A musky scent filled the air.
"We don't tolerate sinners around here, Mr. Stanton," Horatio sneered. "Your tongue spits venom into the ears of all those around you. Lies, they're all you know."
Father Don bellowed, then spat into Hector's face. The crowd parted again. The torches reflected off the murky water ahead. Shadows moved. Not ordinary shadows. Figures appeared lighter than the darkness surrounding them. 3 became 5, then 10, then 30. They meandered closer, closer. Are they walking on water or through it? Hector pondered. Horatio grasped Hector's hair with both hands. Matthew threw a punch into Hector's nose, then mouth. Hector's vision spiraled out of control. Someone or something clenched his aching face. A cold, sharp pain ripped through his mouth. No, not his mouth. He came around. His tongue was being pinched, cut, now severed. Blood filled his mouth. He released a cry of agony only to have it snatched away by the fluid. Father Dawn dangled the meat in front of his eyes.
You shall never utter another lie.
Horatio threw his head forward. Figures of light, shrouded with their own darkness, continued their approach across the lake, with one leading the procession. He wore a 3-piece suit, a large hat, and held a sword. The closer he came, the more his features revealed themselves. Hector didn't believe in ghosts, yet there they were, all coming closer. They walked in 2 rows between the parted crowd. The leader, a man, now a spirit of a hollow light. He was an elderly gentleman. The large hat Hector recognized was a cover. The gold trim was illuminated by the dull glow of a ghost. In his right hand, he carried a cutlass. His face was stern. He stared at Hector, then Horatio, who promptly ran over.
I wish you good evening, sir,
Horatio said with a bow. The spirit scowled at Hector in disgust.
What reason hath this imbecile to be in my presence?
Murder, sir.
What of Fiona?
The spirit inquired.
I'm here,
Fiona said, stepping toward him.
He was too easy. There were so many sins screaming to be set free. He was the biggest liar I've ever known.
He's damned,
Father Dawn blurted out.
He was upon birth,
the spirit replied. Hector fought with his mouth and what remained of his tongue. Words wouldn't flow. Fiona crouched and stared into Hector's eyes. She shook her head, and then ran both hands down his face, while uttering some words which he couldn't make out. The language was lost to him. She covered her eyes, and said a few more words. As her hand moved over her face and hair, what was once long blonde locks turned gray and scraggly. Her skin sagged beneath her eyes. Her cheeks were puffy and dotted with freckles and a mole. A wart perched on the end of her nose with a pulsing boil beneath it. The corners of her mouth curled upwards, flashing rotten, broken teeth. Hector's eyes bulged. The witch cackled as he vomited at the sight of the villagers' flesh melting. Blood, muscle, bone, tissue, and innards formed a soup beneath their feet, which soon returned to the earth from whence it came. Their figures remained unchanged, but their bodies had been replaced with light, as hollow as the spirits beside them.
His soul will go with the others, Sebastian,
Fiona said. She sprung forward and lashed her mouth around Hector's, and ran her tongue over his lips and chin. She withdrew and untied Hector.
He's all yours.
Sebastian grabbed Hector's arm and dragged him amongst the spirits. Hector thrashed and yelled. He was lifted off the ground by dozens of hands. Sebastian led the procession of the dead back to the lake. One by one, their feet set under the water. Hector pulled, kicked, tugged, and yelled. He fought to speak, but only mere noises and groans sprouted. Hands held tighter. Those following behind were now beside the rest and walked atop the water as if it were solid ground. They crouched and pressed down on Hector's chest and stomach as those beneath continued to walk deeper, deeper still, pulling with him their newest member of the Hollow Lake Walkers of New Burnley. Hector held his breath and thrashed harder within his invisible prison. Still, the hands continued pulling him down. Those above watched in quiet awe as his struggles slowed. Hector's heart pounded harder than ever before. Tiny pockets of life floated to the surface. His heart beat frantically, desperate for sweet oxygen. Dizziness set in. He could no longer hold his breath. What remained of his final breath erupted from his mouth. The cold water rushed in. Any illusion he had of surviving was gone. Murky water filled his lungs. His body jerked violently. His heart slowed. Eyes closed. Silence. Here is the final resting place of Hector Stanton.